Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Angie Clark and I'm part of the marketing team here at Perficient. On behalf of our entire team, I'd like to thank you for joining today's webinar. Before we move on to our presentation around utilizing Microsoft 365 security for remote work and teams, I wanted to review a few basic housekeeping items. First, please feel free to submit any questions you may have during the presentation today by typing them in the chat window located up in the right side of your screen. Please make sure to state your questions clearly and our speakers will address those as time allows towards the end of the presentation. If you still have unanswered questions after the webinar or would like to request more information about our services, please feel free to reach out to our speakers directly. You can also fill out the Contact Us form located on our Perficient.com website. A quick note that today's webinar is being recorded and we will send to you within the next few business days a link to that recording as well as to the slides. Now that we've covered a few of those housekeeping items, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. On the call with us is Ron Jones, Perficient's Director of Modern Workplace, and Mark Doberstein, an architect with our Modern Workplace practice. Ron, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Angie. So I will give us a quick profile of Perficient, and then we'll get to the subject at hand. As far as Perficient is concerned, we have over 20 locations, over 3,500 colleagues, and our real goal is just delivering to our clients, which is why we really like to brag about our 95% repeat business rate. We are actually traded on the NASDAQ, and we have global delivery centers in China, India, and Mexico, while also managing and delivering to our partners through a variety of technology and industry verticals and practices. As far as our Microsoft offerings go, we've taken almost 6 million users to the cloud so far, and that's through our really strong dedication to Office 365, now Microsoft 365. A few differentiators that make us special is that we do have a dedicated digital agency for delivering employee experiences, a dedicated OCM or organizational change management practice, which helps with the change management story and some of those adoption change management concepts with the Microsoft stack. And when it comes to teams and security, we have dedicated offerings for both the Microsoft security side of things, as well as Teams, voice, and some of those other pieces. We realize these are uncertain times. Every day we're hearing new updates as far as either people we've lost or just problems that are out there, and also great stories about people persevering through them. And we're just here to let you know that we're here to help. We realize that over 90% of Americans are under stay-at-home orders now, and that means that your new normal is much different than what it was maybe even a couple of weeks ago, definitely 6 months ago. So whether it's a virtual consultation workshop, we also have other offerings for getting you to Teams in 10 days to help with those remote working things that we have to go through. And of course, just improving collaboration to make these things more worthwhile, or helping your organization communicate during crisis times like this. And of course, accelerating adoption. We're here to help. So just let us know. Now let's talk about our agenda for today. We'll start naturally, we just went through introductions. We're going to talk about zero trust and why that is so important to the Microsoft 365 security story. And of course, next we'll get into how it maps to zero trust from a Microsoft 365 perspective. We'll talk through security capabilities and licensing. And we really have a tight 12 steps for securing your Microsoft 365 presence through security. And we have, at the end, we'll talk about our upcoming webinars, as well as our team summit coming up, and we'll save some time for Q&A. And with that, let's get into our introduction. Mark, what's going on?
Sure. So we want to introduce and talk about security from a perspective of the changing landscape of users having to access things remotely, as the workforce is having to move from on-premise corporate infrastructures over to using Microsoft services remotely and increasing that kind of mobile workforce access. So kind of the old model of network-based security using things like firewalls and proxies, that's really no longer adequate as we move this workforce from being on-premise to remote. And looking at things like spread of shadow IT, the rise of cybercrime, as we know, looking at the news and things like that, COVID-19 has put out a lot of malware and phishing that has kind of increased the risk of cybercrime and things like ransomware. So a lot of impacting factors to security and why you should look at investing or increasing your security with Office 365. So we look at, cloud services and increased use of cloud and third-party applications, things like shadow IT, and the rest, and looking at rapid obsolescence of network-based security architecture, right? So since we're moving users away from your on-premise infrastructure, you're looking at how do you protect these users and the applications they're accessing as you basically push them away from your corporate network. So Ron, if you can go to the next slide.
Yeah, most definitely. And it sounds like this is really leading to newer concepts, right? Because if you're not securing it via VPN and your network, then you have to look at things differently, right?
Correct. So that's where we push into this model of zero trust, right? The cybersecurity landscape is really becoming an arms race between like the bad actors and you as a customer, right? And your environments and accessing those applications, right? So improvements in detection, protection, and response are required to basically effectively mitigate attacks that are being presented on a daily basis, right? And so the big point here is moving that trust. And there's a model called zero trust. It was coined actually by Forrester, but basically what it means is shifting away from that idea and model of your corporate infrastructure being a trusted network. So treating everything that accesses your data and your applications as something that's coming from the internet or from a hostile network. So shifting away from that model where you VPN into like your corporate infrastructure and you use your network security like firewalls and proxies and access your data through those processes, thinking that that's secure because you feel like your corporate infrastructure is secure. As we know, even in the recent past, right, with a lot of breaches happening on corporate infrastructure, that
Right.
trusted network is not safe. So there's some pillars of zero trust that really fit in terms of the pieces that you're trying to protect, right? And as can be seen from the model on the right here, the diagram here, we have people, which is identities, protection of devices, your data, your workload, which is your applications, and the transport, which is your networks. And that's all wrapped around, as you'll see with the big circles, visibility and analytics. That means giving you more visibility into the things that happen with these different components, the identity devices, the workload, the data, and then automating responses for security against those things that happen when you start seeing things that are anomalous or where things look like a bad actor may be coming in and doing something to your services. So really that statement at the bottom, every service request made by a user or machine is properly authenticated, authorized, encrypted end to end. So you're not trusting anything in between.
Gotcha. So when you start looking at these different pieces, where's people, networks, devices, workloads, and the orchestration around it, which one would you think is overlooked the most?
Well, the base foundational, I think they're all important pieces, right? But the base foundational is identity. So that's where you got to start, right? You got to start with that identity with people, right?
Right.
And their accounts. So that's the foundational component that you have to start with. And that's the basis of Microsoft's, kind of plan and path to zero trust and remote work is really that, right? So as we see here, the Microsoft 365 path to zero trust, Microsoft's identified 12 key tasks, and this is all based on enterprise licensing. So this would be Office 365, and we'll talk about it in the next slide, but Office 365, E1, E3, and E5 plans, and also Microsoft 365, E3, and E5 plans. But basically, these are the steps or tasks that Microsoft has deemed best to get you to that zero trust or secure remote networking ability. So, items such as enable Azure multi-factor authentication, that's, number one. And then instance configuring Azure advanced threat protection for your on-premise Active Directory and identity integration. And we'll get into more details of each of these in the coming slides.
Gotcha. And I would imagine that, everyone has their own starting point for a journey. So it's more about coverage across these versus, attacking these in sequence. Would you say that?
Right. So this isn't in any particular order, and it all depends on the customization,
Right.
of your environment. So some customers feel like they have certain, points of this already using maybe some other third-party security products. So it's not like we're trying, Microsoft is trying to take that away from there, but understanding what the benefits of the Microsoft services are and maybe that integration, but doesn't mean that you have to, step through every one of these tasks. It's very customizable to whatever you have in your environment.
Gotcha.
So this really talks about what are the security capabilities in these tasks and what kind of licensing requirements you really need, right? So if you look at this table on the first column, right, all all Office 365 enterprise plans. What that means is these capabilities and these tasks can be implemented with any of the standard Office 365 enterprise plans. And again, reiterating what those plans are is your Office 365 E1, E3, and E5 plans. That's the quote unquote Office 365 versus the Microsoft 365 plans. And as we move to the right and within this table, you'll see Microsoft 365 E3 adds a couple additional components, right? So tasks 6, 7, and 8 are added with Microsoft 365 E3. And and just to explain a little bit, because a lot of customers tend to be confused about the difference between Office 365 plans and Microsoft 365 plans, is that Microsoft 365 plans include what's called EMS, or Enterprise Mobility and Security. So those are additional security feature tool sets that come with those plans. So Microsoft 365 E3 comes with what's called Enterprise Mobility and Security E3, which includes what's called Azure AD P1 plans or Premium 1 plans. Then moving again to the right, we have the Microsoft 365 E5 plans. And those Microsoft 365 E5 plans include Enterprise Mobility and Security E5, so even more advanced security services. For instance, the Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection, Azure Advanced Threat Protection, and we'll get into more of these details as we go through the slides.
So let's talk about MFA and how that affects things.
Sure. So the base, security, the foundational component of security is really your identity. And how do you protect your identity, right? So as we know, growing increases of things like malware and phishing attacks, what they're trying to do with a lot of that information, besides ransomware where they're encrypting data and trying to get money from you, is they're actually trying to get credentials, right? And credentials being your username and passwords from users. And what that does is that gives them one component when you're not in a multi-factor authentication models. And what that means is that once they steal a user's credentials, they can act as that user. The real benefit here is if you enable Azure multi-factor authentication, is that you're adding that component that breaks that credential if it's not the actual user, because you're adding this extra factor that the user is only going to have. Say it's the authenticator on the phone or an SMS reply. to get that second factor. So that's where a hacker, they could steal your user's credentials, but they won't have that second factor to be able to use that credential. So
Right.
it
And this seems really
invalidates.
similar to like a lot of things that as a consumer, right? If I'm using an Apple product for my phone, like an iPhone or something like that, like these pieces of MFA are already kind of out there, right?
Right. And what's the benefit too? A lot of customers are going to say, well, I already have a multi-factor authentication platform, say like Duo or RSA, but they're implementing it generally against something like a VPN. And again, they're trusting their network. So people VPN and have that multi-factor authentication piece getting into that trusted network. But then when you go out and go back to the cloud service like Office 365, you're really not protecting, because if you've been breached on your internal network, basically those credentials are still valid, right? And you don't have that second factor against the service. So this is thinking about moving that multi-factor authentication for identity against the actual service and your application access. So giving that factor so that you're protecting right at the service level.
No, I think that makes sense. I mean, I think the second one goes even further, right? As far as protecting against threats in Office 365.
Right. So when we talk about certain threats, like we talked a little bit already about phishing and malware and things like that, Office 365 by default includes what's called Exchange Online Protection, and I've nomenclatured it here as EOP. So that's Exchange Online Protection. And what the recommendation here is bumping up those protections, right? They're at certain default levels within your tenant. When you enable Office 365 and Exchange Online and email, Exchange Online Protections included, but only at a certain level. So going into Exchange Online Protection configuration, a lot of customers don't do that because they'll say, well, I have this other product, right? Mail hygiene product, say, for instance, any of the kind of email hygiene products, like Proofpoint, for instance, they will say, well, I already have that, so that's doing certain things. But the addition is talking about security a lot is you talk about defense in depth, meaning additional layers of protection. So because it's part of the service, it benefits you as a customer to go in there and additionally, configure these pieces in Exchange Online Protection. It doesn't degrade anything. It doesn't, like these are features that are part of the service, so you might as well take advantage of them.
Right. And it also sounds like, whatever comes when you first provision a tenant, it's okay, but it's not good enough. And you still want to revisit those settings is what you're saying too, right?
Right. And you want to test and look at what you're doing with maybe your third party, email hygiene platform in integration with Exchange Online Protection, but at least looking at those pieces. And some customers are relying on just Exchange Online Protection and going in there and making sure that it meets the requirements for your protection of your email.
Gotcha. Let's talk about ATP then.
So Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection is a layer on top of like Exchange Online Protection for email, but it also includes some components for Teams and some other of the workloads. So Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection really is safeguarding against attachments, malware attachments, and also links to malicious URLs. So when you think about that, right, these are some of the services, again, that other emails, third-party services, maybe like Proofpoint, to do these things like safe attachments. What that means is what's called attachment detonation. What they do is take attachments, right? These are advanced services. They take attachments off your email and detonate them in a virtual environment so that if it is actual true malware, that won't filter through to your end user. So that's really advanced protection for that kind of vector of attack. Proofpoint does that and does also safe links. Safe links are links in emails that go to malicious URLs. And the benefit here is Microsoft is really uses a lot of security signals, and they're able to go out to these URLs and know if they're malicious links, right? And the additional benefit here that, say, an email hygiene product wouldn't have is that these safe links are also integrated into Teams. So basically, when you start putting links and you have Office 365 Advanced Threat Protection, you can use the safe link integration into Teams. So even if someone posts a link in Teams and clicks on it and it goes to a malicious URL, it'll block it. So that's an additional benefit that you can't really get if you're just trying to do these things with a product, say like Proofpoint.
Gotcha. And then you have the next phase of that too with, configuring Azure Advanced Threat Protection.
So Azure Advanced Threat Protection, again, because identity is the foundation of your security, right? So identity hybrid integration with identity is something that you really want to think about in terms of most enterprise customers are synchronizing Active Directory on-prem to Azure Active Directory that's backing up their Office 365 or Microsoft 365 platform, right? So that's what's in Microsoft's world is called hybrid identity. So most enterprise customers are doing this hybrid identity. Well, it doesn't benefit you as a customer if you're doing that and you only protect the identity once it's in Azure Active Directory. So what Advanced Threat Protection, Azure Advanced Threat Protection uses the power of the cloud, uses the power of Azure with machine learning and artificial intelligence to basically look at data coming from your Active Directory. So you put on these little, what they call sensors on your domain controllers, or you could have a machine that's dedicated to sending the signal data from on-prem Active Directory and basically sends it up to Azure and basically analyzes that data. So it monitors user and behaviors that are along that security kill chain. What that means is like to break into like an on-premise Active Directory, you have this kind of kill chain model where there's a reconnaissance process, an exploit process, and an elevation process where users, where bad actors are coming in and going through that process. This will actually know and see that kind of activity going on and send that information up to Azure to basically analyze and tell you. And you can also do things like basically get a fast triage and understand this is happening in your environment and shut those activities down, right? You could disable users that are being used for lateral movement or elevation of privileges, things like that. So this really protects that whole identity, hybrid identity infrastructure all the way up to Office 365.
Gotcha. And then the next phase is to get it to Microsoft 365 as well, right?
Yeah, so this is basically number 5 is turn on Microsoft Threat Protection. And this is, again, an E5 only point, but what it is it takes the signals from all those advanced security services that Microsoft provides. So if you have an E5 licensing, you can implement Office 365 ATP, Azure ATP. Those are 2 that we've already talked about. There's also a couple other services like Azure Identity Protection that increases risk protection, basically analyzes risky sign-ins and risky user IDs and provides a way to remediate those users. Then there's also Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection, which is, again, a level up of, it's not antivirus, it's actual protection for those kind of lateral movements happening on actual end users' workstations. And then Microsoft Cloud App Security, which is Microsoft's cloud access security broker. What Microsoft Threat Protection does is take the signals from all these services and puts them in one big single pane of glass. It's basically one-stop shopping for looking at all the things that may be happening in your environment, right? So you look at these different things going on and you understand the integration point of all of these. So it gives you alerts and automation. Remember, we talked about the zero trust model and we talked about automation and orchestration of remediation for security issues. This actually puts that in that one pane view and you can start working at automating a remediation plan against that.
All right, so hypothetically, if I had more of a best of breed approach with different tools like Proofpoint and others, maybe a different CASB solution, I would have to hop between solutions potentially, while this would really just centralize everything into one threat protection dashboard, it looks like.
Right. So that is the power of all these services, right, that
Mhm.
Microsoft has put together from a security service standpoint, the power of the integration. Again, a lot of customers have all these different great products, right, out there, these third-party security products, but they don't integrate well together. So
Right.
you do have to go looking at, and a lot of customers are trying to cobble it together into like a SIM infrastructure. But this,
Hmm.
what the nice thing about this is that this is already built into the service. You don't have to put that extra time in and trying to integrate it into your SIM service, and SIM being the security incident and event monitoring services out there, which Microsoft also has a tool set for called Sentinel, but we won't talk about that in this.
Gotcha. Yeah, I was going to ask what that was about. So that's awesome. And then from here, we go to number 6, which is really about securing your mobile devices and other pieces, right?
Right. So we look at configuring Intune mobile app protection. What this really does is, as people are moving remote, right, and not every customer can provide devices for access for remote. So as people are working from home, they're having to use whatever type of devices they may have. They may only have a mobile device like a tablet or a phone to be able to connect to your company's you know applications. So what a recommendation here is to enable Intune mobile application management, which is basically app protection. What that means is that you can put work-based applications on that person's mobile device, but those applications data, it's like a container. It's what's called a container. So basically, that data that resides in those applications can't be moved to other applications that are maybe personal applications. For instance, you had personal OneDrive or you had personal Dropbox, and someone wanted to copy and paste from a protected app. Once you put these policies in place on their device, basically they can't copy and paste from, like, say, Word, which is part of your your company's app protected policy. They can't copy it from the work Word version to like Dropbox, a file in Dropbox. It protects it from that. So it's kind of a DLP, data leakage protection type of policy, but
Hmm.
for mobile devices.
Gotcha. And it sounds like there are also, like looking at the call out, there's some starting points for just basic policies and recommended things. So you're not starting from ground zero either.
Right. So there's a lot of guidance from Microsoft around building
Hmm.
these app protection policies, and then also enforcing them once you create these policies with conditional access. So conditional access is that process of um, letting people access certain things based on the conditions of certain components. So talking about the protection of devices, if that device doesn't have this protection, then you could say they can't access the corporate applications with that conditional access policy. So then moving on to the next one, which is number 7, we talk about configuring MFA and conditional access. You did it for your normal corporate users. You want to start looking at if you have guest users, right? You set up guest accounts and accessing your environment with guest accounts. You want to protect your environment from those guest accounts too. So what's nice about what Microsoft's doing with the licensing here is that with guests, basically any of the Azure E5 and or E3 and E5 plans, right? We talked about those plans having EMS or Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite, is that they also have Azure AD Premium P1 or P2 licensing. And what that does is, as long as you have that licensing, they have a 5-to-1 ratio that allows you whatever features of that Azure AD Premium 1 or Premium 2 plan, they allow you to use up to 5 guests with that same functionality. So when you have MFA enabled, you can also force MFA against your against your external guest users too. So you can do those things, like I said, with protections based on that licensing. And also, if you have E5, you have the additional basis of protecting them with risk-based multi-factored conditional access rules. So what that really means is when you have an E5 plan, you have that additional Azure identity protection. That's going out and looking at things like risky sign-ins, and there's a bunch of machine learning and artificial intelligence applied to how a user behaves. So for instance, a user is always coming from a certain location. So say they're coming from their home network now because they're remote, right, and sequestered at home. It understands that risk-based, that identity protection. It starts collating that you're coming from the same IP majority of the time, say the 30 days, right? And then all of a sudden your identity is starting to come from somewhere else, some other location. That is a risk, right? Because you're probably not moving, right, to this other location if you're always coming from the same location majority of the time. And it'll give you warnings and understand, and you can do conditional access, meaning that you can block if you start to see some of these risky, kind of sign-ins and logins happening to your environment.
Oh, it makes sense. And that also means I can set up those policies around, it mentioned guests and external users, and a lot of those are either like partners who I would invite in via like an extranet scenario, right? So if we're partnering with, as a consulting firm, if we're working for customers and we have one place where we all collaborate, then I can set rules on our side of things for, how people enter our space, so to speak, right? And I think that also helps and provides a lot of power for policing some of these things.
Right. It's basically giving that same protection that you're applying to your corporate users against those guests and external partners.
Exactly.
The next one is enrolling PCs, right? So as you work with Windows 10 machines and things like that, you can also add them to be compliant and have access policy rules. What that really means is that you define device compliance policies. This is after you enroll them. So one of the easiest ways to enroll Windows 10 machines is autopilot. So not going to get into the details of autopilot here, but basically they can enroll and set up your base applications, say Office 365 applications on a Windows 10 machine coming straight from the manufacturer or coming straight from a from your vendor. And so as those are being sent out, or they could also be done if a person brings in a personal Windows 10 machine, you could get that set up in autopilot to set up their default applications. The benefit here then is once they're enrolled, you can basically apply device compliance policies for Windows 10. And what that means is that you can say that it has to have a certain antivirus protection. It could have Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection on it as a requirement, different components and device compliance requirements. And then once you've added those device compliance requirements in a policy, you can require those compliant PC systems to basically be able to access. So conditional access rules based on that compliance. So for instance, if someone for some reason were to turn off antivirus on their Windows 10 machine and then try to connect to your environment, your Office 365, and you had that conditional access rule said that the required antivirus has to be running, then they wouldn't be able to connect, right? So until that was alleviated. So this is basically protecting your environment and making sure that those Windows 10 machines are compliant to and safe to connect to your environment.
Right, and
so that's where that device protection comes in, right? From the
zero definitely, and it sounds like it's continuing to do so too. So to your point, if I decide that my antivirus is slowing down my machine for some reason, I can enforce a rule where I can't join the network again until I, turn that back on. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Turn it back on and get, like, say, the latest updates, right? Yeah. Because, that can be a gate. So you can set up these compliance gates against your Windows 10 machines or your PCs to basically access your environment.
Right. And it sounds like I'm also helping to protect against my own users, accidentally doing something, or maybe even, maliciously doing something, which are usually in the minority, right? But you just want to have some of those safeguards in place, it sounds like.
Yep, exactly.
Yep. All right, let's go to number 9.
So this is a big one, right? In this environment right now, as people are working from home, right, you want the best performance and access as you can. And a lot of customers, right, are looking at right now, because you were on-prem until more recently, and with the and in corporate networks, and a lot of people working from corporate networks, there's a lot of requirements saying that you have to come from that trusted corporate network to connect to Office 365. So the problem as people move to these remote locations and work from home and things, if you force that environment to go through your corporate network so that you can go through your network security stack, right, like your proxies and firewalls, you force them to come through VPN, whatever that VPN process, and you're kind of boomeranging them, meaning that you're going that reverse, you're coming from home, making them come through your corporate network, and then go back out the internet back to Office 365. Doesn't make a lot of sense. But a lot of customers are looking at that because they don't have these protections in place for the service, right? So all of these protections that we've been talking about already kind of expand that protection against the service, so you can start to move those users away from going through your corporate network and going through your network protection stack. So basically you can move them so that if they have to come to VPN for, say, an on-premise application, they can still do that, but what's called split tunneling, you route that network traffic that wants to go to Office 365, you don't make it come through your corporate network, right? You split it, and that traffic will go directly to Office 365, which is going to give the best performance and productivity for your end users, right? The best user experience, versus making them come through your network and then back out. I know a lot of security teams at customers feel safe with that process of making people come through your network, but again, that's because they haven't looked at these other services for the Office 365 service to protect them, right? So you're shifting that protection to the service. So you're shifting identity protection, device protection directly to the service and application protection.
Because I would imagine that hub and spoke model that you're inferring is really just going back to that network security philosophy versus something like, zero trust, which, challenges everything.
Right, exactly. You're forcing them back to that trusted, quote unquote, trusted network, which really isn't. Again, the benefit here is that you're not really looking at a trusted network. You're considering everything hostile, right? That's what the zero trust is really about. And it's a continuous process, right? When people are connecting to the service with all these additional security services, they're actually getting signals all the time. So it's not like one and done where person connects and then they're allowed to connect all the time. It's actually evaluating that access and connection on a continuous basis, so that you're not, doing just the one gate access.
Gotcha. And so far we've talked about the applications that are available for us, no matter how we're licensed. We've talked about licensing and protecting apps, right? We've gone through devices, and we're even talking about how we connect back. Let's talk about training users, which is number 10.
Sure. So training users is really a point, right? You're adding all these different services or changing services, right? You're changing and adding these security services. It's really making sure that they understand how to use these different services or how it affects them in terms of a user experience. Because if you just throw these services out there and you don't train your users, what you're going to end up with is a lot of people calling the help desk, right? They're going to be calling and saying, hey, this popped up and what do I do with this, right? Kind of thing, because the service asks, for instance, just Azure MFA, right? It's going to pop up and say that you need an additional configuration here, or you need an additional process to be able to log on. If you don't, communicate with your users and train them on that process, then you're going to have a lot of people coming back. And that's what some of these items are for, right? So
Mhm.
Microsoft is putting out these, resources like the learning pathways. You can kind of build a customized learning path for your users. Learning modules, and this is more for the administrator, right? Securing your organization with built-in intelligent security from Microsoft 365. So there's learning modules also for your administrator side. And then things like, for instance, here at the bottom, the multi-factor authentication, right? So you got that two-step verification. What is the additional verification page? That's articles and information on
Mhm.
giving out to users so they understand what they're seeing with these.
Right, and it feels like some things are more in the user's face, like multi-factor authentication, which, is enabled on each device that you have, versus some things just kind of happening in the background and some of the things we talked about for building dashboards, right?
Right.
And I guess another piece to this, of course, is, preparing your help desk, because your end users are one thing, your administrators are something else, but as people go to your ITSM, whether it's, ServiceNow or whatever, to enter tickets because they think they're having issues, preparedness on that side sounds important too.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right.
Awesome. All right, let's look at number 11, which is, getting started with MCAS.
So Cloud App Security, Microsoft Cloud App Security is the full version. So Microsoft Cloud App Security is the E5 version. If you have E3 or standard Office 365 enterprise plans, it's called Office 365 Cloud App Security or Office Cloud App Security. A little bit more scaled down version of Cloud App Security, but what Cloud App Security really is a platform. It's a cloud access security broker. What it does is give you control over access and anomaly detection in different cloud applications. So as you go out there, and we talked about as users are remote, right, they're going to go and try and find tools that make their life easier, right? And this has happened on-prem, and it's happening even more as people go remotely, right? Because you have less control over what people use. So people will start using products from other vendors that may not be approved from your corporate policy. For instance, using Dropbox to store corporate data. What Cloud App Security does is help you control that sprawl and that access to those third-party cloud applications. So you can put in policies that say, connecting Dropbox, you can't copy and paste things into Dropbox, for instance. So again, those controls and those security controls to control third-party applications and things that are that could become shadow IT. And again, the E5 version is the full-blown one, and what it does is discover more applications. So the again, the Office 365 enterprise plans and the Microsoft 365 E3 support Office Cloud App Security, and that is a little bit more slimmed down. So it doesn't discover as many applications and things as the full version that's included with E5. But they are still giving a more limited version, which is still a benefit to a lot of customers, understanding and discovering what people are using out there.
Gotcha. We also have some links on this one to kind of help to separate those two paths so you know what you're getting with each one.
Correct.
Awesome. All right, let's go to number 12 for monitoring threats and taking action, of course.
So this is, again, I would say this isn't really the last, and these weren't, again, in order, but some of it's a little bit repetitive because we talked about Microsoft threat protection, right? That single pane of glass. And this is really what it's talking about, is that it's that same single pane of glass going to like security, the security pane in Microsoft 365 and being able to see all that alerting and everything. One other item here that's specified here that you really very, very important is the Microsoft Secure Score. Microsoft put out this tool, and it's basically what it is it evaluates what you've configured in the service. So things like MFA or MFA for admins, those different pieces, certain configurations in Exchange Online Protection, all of the different components within Office 365, they get a score. So it's an arbitrary score. But it's basically gives you a nice idea of how secure your environment is from a configuration that Microsoft's specifying that versus a total score. And what's nice too in that security score is that it also gives you a comparison to other tenants that maybe your same size or in your same industry. For instance, if you set it for healthcare, it will give you a score based upon what your other industry partners score is. So you can kind of compare and contrast and understand how well your score and how well your configuration of security is against others, and also increasing your own score, right? And it's a little bit gamification, but basically you want to increase your score. And as Microsoft brings out new services and new functionality and configurations, they're adding that to the score. So it's kind of a dynamic process. So high recommendation to go and look at the security dashboard and look at that secure score. And that comes with every version of Office 365 again. So it doesn't matter if it's your standard Office 365 enterprise plans or if it's your E3, E5 Microsoft 365 plans.
No, that's great. And as you said, it's, a task list of 12 things, but you can approach it, you just want to make sure you have coverage across the 12, not necessarily in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like numerical order, which is really great too. I definitely agree that, starting with your secure score is really helpful, and also allows you to compare yourself against, other industries and verticals too, which is helpful.
Correct. So and again, like you said, this isn't a prescriptive, this is the order.
Yeah.
But what the benefit is it is giving you the tasks and giving you information about what Microsoft provides, right? And the integration benefit, right? So there's a lot of things that we talked about. There's that integration benefit, right? So these services have been created to work together instead of in their own little silo. So like a lot of security services out there, those third-party security services you might already have, but the benefit of looking at the Microsoft services is that integration point because they're easily integratable. For instance, when we talk about anomaly detection in Microsoft, and I'll just give one last example here, Microsoft Cloud App Security, and looking at email, to integrate that with, say, like Proofpoint, you have to connect that that service Proofpoint over to Cloud App Security or to a cloud access security broker, whereas Cloud App Security does that by default. When you implement Cloud App Security, it actually has that integration with Exchange Online already built into it. You don't have to add that additional configuration where you do something like Proofpoint to a CASB, like the McAfee CASB, for instance. So those additional configurations, and also kind of not efficient configurations, right? Why do you want to port data that comes from Proofpoint over to a CASB and back so that you can just look at the data coming in? Whereas the services from Microsoft, like Cloud App Security, are already integrated into the service so that you get that benefit of that high level of integration.
Oh, makes sense. This has been really helpful, Mark. I mean, just for everyone tuned in and watching this video, we do have a few more webinars coming up. Next week, we have a double header with accelerating adoption and change management for Microsoft Teams for remote work on the 16th. And we also have a special treat of preparing for Project Cortex, which is the future of knowledge management, and how that's going to affect how we look at knowledge management now and what you can do today to get prepared. Also want to make sure we do a small plug for our Team Summit coming up on April 20th. Should be a whole day, really great content, whether you are an administrator of Microsoft Teams to adoption change management folks, and of course, executive strategists, those kind of folks that are looking to get more out of the platform. Really good stuff coming up. So Mark, I really want to thank you for your help today. Everything's been really insightful. It's been really helpful just getting through a lot of these things. I realized that a lot of our folks just don't know where to start. So this has been a really good session as far as getting through things to look out for, how we can start with a zero trust approach to things, how that's different from our normal way of thinking. So thanks a lot for joining us today. I really appreciate it, Mark.
Thanks, Ron. I appreciate being here and being able to give some helpful information. Hopefully, get some information out there that really will help customers protect their environments.
Definitely. So along that line, we do have a couple of questions that came in. So starting with this one, when did you start looking into zero trust, and what was the aha moment for you?
So looking at zero trust, right, it really started back in the earlier times when we were looking at things going to cloud, right? So it's that shift from thinking about that trusted network, right? Back when I first started looking at it, I didn't know it was called zero trust, truthfully. Back in like 2010, 2011, when zero trust first came out, I understood the model of shifting away and from that trusted network and shifting to protections that actually protect the services and applications versus relying on that trusted network. So it's been a while in terms of the idea. The idea has been around for myself since the time of going to cloud in my first Office 365 migrations, but didn't know it was zero trust. Called that for a few years or so.
Gotcha. So what's been one of the things as far as like when we start challenging our um, way of thinking, what has been the largest challenge that you've seen so far as when you start talking to customers about zero trust and kind of shifting that mindset?
Well, I think it's really that, right? It's shifting away because people are, a lot of security people are comfortable with what they've put together, right? It's kind of like, calling your baby ugly kind of thing, right?
Right.
It's
Yeah.
like they put that network security stack together. They put all these policies together in their on-prem infrastructure. It's shifting that mindset away from there. Not saying that that it's not relevant, but you have to additionally add on to that, right? We
Right.
talked about that defense in depth, right? Additional layers. It doesn't mean you take away those layers that you already have fully, but it's adding those additional security services so that you have, if you get past gate 1, gate 2 is there, right? So it's those layers as you add on top of each other. So it's thinking about those different things and not shifting away from that whole model of everything's safe if I get you on-prem, somehow
Gotcha.
connected on-prem.
Yeah, and there's also the human factor to it too. It sounds like where, if I can make remote work more seamless via something like this, and get to the point of knowing that if I have my identity on my device and I've verified that, then I should have access to the tools that I need in order to be productive at work. And of course, there's a lot that goes into that, right? It's a very simple way of looking at it, but once you start, looking at that as an outcome, then zero trust seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also the other idea that I wanted to put out there. One of the things that was on the network page and adjusting your network infrastructure that we didn't talk about was Azure app proxy. And that's
Yeah.
another thing to shift people away from making everything on-prem or having to connect to on-prem via like VPN. So what Azure app proxy is that allows customers to take some of that access to on-prem applications and move it away from your VPN. What it is that it's an agent that gets put on a machine on your environment, and can connect to web applications that are on your environment. So say you have a line of business applications that you need your users to be able to access remotely, but you want to alleviate some of the VPN access and things like that, you can use Azure Active Directory identities to connect to those on-prem applications. So that what that agent does, it's an outbound agent, and it calls out to Office 365 and says, hey, do you have a user that needs some data from this web application? The other benefit of integrating something like that is that the policies that you apply for conditional access for identities in Azure AD, say MFA and those additional pieces, those apply to those app proxy applications as you set them up. The other benefit is that a lot of security teams don't like that inbound connection be it 443 or TLS connections, even to VPN, you're opening a hole in your firewall. The Azure App Proxy is actually benefiting your environment to not open any firewall, inward firewall rules
Right.
to access an application on-prem.
Right. So then you can take kind of a two-pronged approach to, all your 365 stuff is definitely secured, but then you can start allowing paths to time reporting or, you name it, those line of business applications that you talked about that as a standard employee, I need to be able to look at my expenses and time reporting and those other things that may still be on-prem.
Correct.
That's awesome. Yeah, and that was the third question in here, so that's even better. I can strike through that one. All right, and one of the last ones, of course, is just, have you ever, well, not have you ever, but are there scenarios where, having a best of breed approach or maybe even multiple applications that do the same thing when it comes to security have negative effects on an environment? Like I'm thinking about like you have your high settings in EOP and then you have Proofpoint doing this and then, a few other things that kind of doing the same job. Have you seen scenarios like that?
Yeah, and again, defense in depth, when you start talking, that's really what that concept is, right? Multiple security controls for the same thing, right? The depth of security controls.
Right.
It's just working through what that integration is, right? So if you have certain configurations in Proofpoint, in that example, and EOP, it's just making sure those don't collide, right? So working through those two together, right? So it's really working through and dealing with how do those integrations work. And that's again going back to that whole point of Microsoft Security Services having that high integration point. You don't have to worry about those integration modes, right? And those things colliding with each other because they're made to work together. Giving another example of what's working together. So we talked about Microsoft Cloud App Security and blocking access to, say, an unsanctioned application or an application that you don't want your corporate users to use. For instance, they're starting to use Dropbox, and you see that in Cloud App Security. You can say unsanction that app. There's a nice integration between Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection, which actually has a software firewall built into it that can block those same applications. Normally, you can only block those from on-prem because it's configuring your firewall to block those applications. So that high integration with Defender Advanced Threat Protection gives you that capability of blocking those applications that you're not wanting people to use, no matter where they are. So say they're at home or wherever they're using their computer.
No, that's awesome. All right, I guess we're going to wrap up. Mark, thanks again so much for joining us today. Everyone tuning in, please stay tuned for next week. Like I said, we have a doubleheader that we'll remind you about shortly. Guess I'll throw it back to Angie. Can you take us home?
I sure can, Ron. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us for today's presentation. As we previously indicated, you will receive a recording of today's presentation along with the slides within the next few business days. So look for that, and thanks and have a great day.